Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam, and I'm not in the Newscast studio because I'm making a flying visit to Glasgow.
It's Paddy in the Newscast studio, and I've just seen Professor Sir John Curtis in reception.
It's all starting. Hello, it's Laura in the studio, and I am here.
Hello and welcome to Newscast. Newscast is the BBC's daily news podcast, which you can listen to on BBC Sounds. But every week we're popping up here on Radio 4. Normally we're live at 11 o'clock, but this is sort of pretend live because we're actually recording it at 9 o'clock because Laura's quite busy doing...
Well, a programme tomorrow, a big programme with some very important guests and also practising for the election. So for most of the day, I'll be locked in the basement in Broadcasting House.
So if this is recorded,
Yes.
Does that mean it'll be better than the last 3 weeks that we've done?
We can only hope.
I wonder if they've taken that bit out. Anyway, this is getting too meta now. So I wonder how many hours it is until the polls close. Well, we don't know because we don't know what time it is because we're in the wrong time.
Oh, this is getting very confusing. Shall we get on with it?
Yeah. Laura, what are your predictions then for the last few days of campaigning?
Well, I think, look, it's been a very, very eventful campaign. So, 24 hours ago, nobody would have predicted that the Prime Minister would have inserted himself very dramatically into a race row about reform candidates. So I'm not going to make predictions about specifics. However, generically, what we'd see at this moment, when there are 4 days left on the stump, is every single political party doing as many miles as they possibly can. Ed Davey got a private jet to go and get on his Lib Dem battle bus that's going to start at John O'Groats and I think go all the way down to Cornwall. All of the leaders we're going to see out and about. I think there's a big Labour rally today. There might be some celebs involved. Ooh, watch out for echoes of the Sheffield Rally in 1992, everybody. But so we'll see lots and lots of images of campaigning. In terms of surprises, the parties won't want any.
I mean, in fact, what we've been characterised by as pundits watching this election is stubborn polls, unusual events, and the two parties that are likely to form a government, Labour and Conservatives, devoid of a shining city on the hill idea. And I'm not being rude to the Conservatives and the Labour Party, but in last week's newscast, we discussed previous elections with massive offers. This is basically a giant opinion poll election in which the opinion polls have been as dominant as a political party themselves. And with 4 days left, I still say we should be prepared for events and unexpected surprises. And I am still staggered that the Prime Minister of my country has used the P word on national television, Adam, in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, it was interesting thinking back to the profile we did of Rishi Sunak with some journalists and people who know him, which you can listen to on BBC Sounds. We were remarking on that fact that his race never really comes up, other than when he became Prime Minister and everyone said, oh, it's the first British Asian Prime Minister and he's a Hindu, and then all of that disappeared. And so it's been quite weird that it's then come roaring back, but sort of with a negative framing because of those comments from a Reform UK campaigner. And so, yeah, for me, it's quite weird. It feels almost quite retro that that's the discussion about the Prime Minister's race that we're having, that it's because of a racial slur.
But I think there will be many voters, whether they are of an ethnic minority or not, who will have actually been heartily pleased to hear the Prime Minister go after that kind of language that had been expressed by a reform activist and revealed by our colleagues at Channel 4 News. And to see him, according to people who work for him, to see him in that way actually being genuinely angry, genuinely forthright, genuinely speaking with conviction, rather than one of his sort of political scripts. So if you spin back a few weeks, what did Rishi Sunak, or a few months frankly, often get criticised for? Sticking to an incredibly careful political script. Spreadsheet man, accused of being robotic. I don't think anybody could watch that, apart from perhaps the deepest cynic, and, there are some of them around. I don't think anybody could watch that clip from yesterday and think that he was not expressing a genuinely held conviction and anger about what had been said about him and the impact on his daughters, as he said. But, there were lots of commentators yesterday, lots of conversations online saying every British South Asian will have heard that word, will have had that slur chucked at them. And to see the most powerful politician in the land stand up and call it out had meaning.
Yes, and also, I think until I actually witness physical excrement coming out of the mouth of people in our public conversation, I won't think it's got any worse. For years on Radio 4 on Sunday morning, we have heard people beg for our public conversation to improve. We have had the murder on the streets of two of our MPs, Joe Cox and David Amos. We have had a sewer of public conversation on social media. Many people have come on the airwaves on Radio 4 begging for us to up our game. We have had just weeks ago Nigel Farage, who many of our listeners say is a failure trampolined by the media, who's failed 7 times to be elected. He told us that our Prime Minister didn't understand our culture, and that was obviously to do with the D-Day matter, which we've criticised, shared the criticism of here on the airwaves. And that was then explained away as being he couldn't go into a pub. But actually, we do need to say on Radio 4 that the Prime Minister of this country has just been forced to use the P word, and it is a moment with days to go in this election, and in a way I'm not surprised. What was going to happen in our public?
Well, no, but I was just going to say he wasn't actually forced to use the P word because, and I'm disagreeing with you here very respectfully, Paddy, because actually there were choices here. You could make a choice to just ignore it and not dignify a slur with repeating it or even acknowledging it, or you could refer to it and paraphrase it but not say the offensive word, or you could then have the middle ground approach the BBC's taken to it, which is to broadcast it but bleeps, but everyone knows what's underneath the bleep, or you could take the position the Prime Minister took, which is kind of like the top end of the scale, which is to actually just repeat it and say the word.
But I think that's the point here, is from, I think, a personal but also a political point of view, that Rishi Sunak and his team have decided to say enough. And they knew exactly what they were doing. I think they knew that people would be shocked. They knew that it would get headlines for him to repeat the slur rather than just, as Adam said, oh, I disapprove of anybody using that kind of language. It's not the kind of thing. So they put rocket boosters on the story by doing it. But I think it was personal as well as political. Of course, though, there are question marks being asked about why Rishi Sunak had not called out other kinds of racist behaviour or incidents in the same way, with the same level of anger, with the same level of conviction. Of course, eyebrows were raised when he didn't come rapidly with strong condemnation of what Frank Hester, the Conservative donor, had said about Diane Abbott, the longest-serving female black MP. He did condemn that language, but the Conservative Party really, really had trouble over a few days giving it that kind of very stark, clear condemnation. And there are various other episodes, you know, I mean, in all political parties, yes, but it is a regular criticism of the Conservative Party that in various different incidents, they have been slow to call out particularly Islamophobia, but other kinds of insults and other kinds of standard of behaviour. So I think this is not straightforward for Rishi Sunak, but it is very much a big moment in the campaign. Yeah. Whether it will shift any votes or not, I have no idea. But for him, it is definitely an important and memorable moment of him as a politician. And some of his supporters might say, both there and at the debate this week that we talked about on Wednesday night in Nottingham, some people might feel in the Conservative Party, where was this guy a few weeks ago?
Well, I mean, I do stand corrected by Adam. I did hear a very interesting discussion on Today, led by Michelle Hussain, that the Prime Minister did not have to repeat the P word. So actually, I do stand corrected by you. I think I said he was compelled to use the P word. But I suppose what I'm trying to do is just own that, feel that sort of sense of ownership he was trying to portray to the public, is that it's the most emotional I've ever seen him, and I'm not the expert that you two are.
I think, without doubt.
And you've just summed it up. Where was this man? He has had a form in the last few days, including in the leaders' debate. That was on with Michelle Hussain, funnily enough, on the BBC. So look, that's an issue that's hot in the news. Adam, you started off saying, what will the last 4 days bring? And inevitably, I'm bound to say more of the same. I am braced for surprise. I think that's a very wise way to look at the whole course of this election. Events.
I think that's right, because actually at the beginning of the campaign, people sort of thought, oh, well, maybe it'll be a bit boring because the two central protagonists, and the small parties have a big role in this election, but the two central protagonists are routinely called, you know, dull and duller by some of their opponents, which is very rude, but I emphasise that's not my phrase. Or, you know, they're like a local bank manager, and I'm not insulting bank managers, but, you know, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are both sort of technocratic, not fire and brimstone politicians. So it was, this campaign might be a bit of a yawn fest. Actually, anything but, because the events have been wild. Gamblegate, if it's big enough to call it a gate, you know, the D-Day disaster, now this race row, the entrance of Nigel Farage and the behaviour and the vile remarks that have been revealed almost daily by some of the people who are standing for his party, who we should remind listeners have not all been chucked out, as he seemed to suggest on television last night. He said, I disown these people, I don't want anything to do with them. They're still standing, they're still on the list for the party.
Yeah, which is incidentally the same with the Greens, the Green candidate who said that Hamas are the home guard and the French resistant. That person's still standing. The Green candidate who said that October the 7th is orchestrated, that person's still standing. And I go back to where I started, boring people at the beginning of our newscast.
Paddy, you'd never bore
Well,
me.
the thing is that when will we all get together and say that the public conversation has descended into the sewer? I don't know, because we've only been hearing this for about 10 years now, a desperate attempt to go back. And also, I will say, now I'm on my soapbox, I'm not at all sure that the member of the public at the leaders' debate who asked the two leaders, Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, if they were are you the best that can be offered? I'm not at all sure that man is speaking for me. And with respect, he may very well be a Radio 4 listener and listening, so I don't want to personalise it, but I don't think that's very good manners. And I would rather prefer the return of manners, Adam. And you can call me Miss Manners if you want.
I was going to sit up more straight now.
Yeah, I actually have to sit up more straight. Just as you said, that is a reflex reaction. I mean, I'm in the city where I went to school, so maybe that's why. I'm glad you mentioned that, Paddy, because I've been thinking about this quite a lot, because me and Laura were both in the spin room on Wednesday night at the BBC debate in Nottingham, and that guy, Robert, who asked that question, it was something along the lines of, what is wrong with our political system if you two are the best that we've got? And it got a big round of applause in the room. And I think the reason those of us who were in Nottingham jumped on that was because, on the stage you had the Labour leader and the Conservative leader, and then up popped Robert to represent what feels like quite a big chunk of the public who just aren't sure or aren't convinced or aren't enthusiastic by the choice between those two. And so it seemed like, actually, Robert's almost like the third person on that stage, and that sort of feeling is normally a bit invisible. So we jumped on it because of that. And then there was just the response in the room. I mean, he got the biggest round of applause from the audience. And of course, everyone in the room is looking for the electric moments, because that's what makes a better story about debate night. And it wasn't until the next morning where actually the other side of the argument of people saying, hang on, is that really, well, as you were just saying, is that a polite way of phrasing that question? And then people saying, well, hang on, we expect quite a lot of our politicians. And then, of course, you got the US debate, which was just a completely different, lower level of quality than the one we just had, some people would argue. And then, so then that's why the narrative around that question kind of rebalanced over the next 24 hours. So I'm glad you gave me an opportunity to talk about my personal journey around that question.
Unusual for you to talk about your personal journey, Adam.
Yeah. Well, my flight home got cancelled, so that's another aspect of my personal journey.
Well, if you're wondering what on earth is going on, listeners, you are listening to Radio 4, but this is a special election episode of Newscast, which is the BBC's daily news podcast. During the election, we are on air every day, normally available on BBC Sounds, but every Saturday morning we have the pleasure, you perhaps have the slightly more dubious pleasure, of having us coming out of your wireless or wherever you are listening to the radio this morning.
I mean, even I'm not still going on about the wireless.
We're not meant to say the wireless.
No, you are. You're going to win votes from me if you
I'm going to say, because you're very much in your outrage.
No, I would love to speak up about FM. But I'd be sacked if I was allowed. You're allowed to come on here and say wireless. I'm over the moon that you have. Now, look, can the two of you remind me of other incidents close to polling day? I'm not going to hold you to the final week, but there have been famous. You mentioned, did you mention the rally at which Neil Kinnock in Sheffield said we're all right?
We did, yeah.
He's been very candid on Radio 4, speaking to Jim Naughtie, and it was the most extraordinarily candid thing. He said, Glynis's wife said,
yes.
Sorry, it's not in their eyes. It's not in their eyes. Adam, you're imminent.
Yeah, I was listening to that. So Jim Naughty's been doing these series of pieces for The World at One, where he's been travelling around the UK and visiting significant places. And as a geographer, as I always bang on about studying geography and how much I loved it, I love it when we bring places back into the conversation. And yeah, his piece about the Sheffield Rally, and I was just going to say exactly the bit that you picked out, Paddy, which was Neil Kinnock saying, yeah, we knew, me and Glynis, from going around the country 2 weeks out, that we weren't going to do it. And that's interesting because a lot of the commentariat hadn't picked up that message. It wasn't until much later. But it is interesting because I always thought the last kind of 2 weeks of the election was, nothing that much ever happens because everyone's so disciplined and everyone's got their messages. But actually, Sheffield Rally was the week before. Mrs. Duffy, when Gordon Brown got caught on the hot mic, that was 10 days before.
Was it?
Absolutely astonishing story. I mean, they'd not had a good campaign and it was clear that the way it was going. But that is one of those news stories where I remember it happened and the kind of crackle in the newsroom and everybody went, stop what you're doing. And it was a huge story. Whether ultimately it made the blind bit of difference in people's decision making, we'll never really know. But it was a massive story and a real calamity.
That immigration was the hot topic that led to the exchange with Gillian Duffy and Gordon Brown saying, "Who put me with that bigoted woman?" And she was later said to have simply been expressing a fear that people had about integration based on the numbers of people arriving.
But that's why it was such a devastating story. Because Labour had been long accused by not listening to people's genuine concern about changes they could see in their community. Pressure on primary schools, for example, if you had people who'd come from Eastern Europe in a time during freedom of movement and there were suddenly extra kids in the class but no extra teacher. Or looking at how people's, I remember the story, one MP telling me of a roofer who'd been charging 200 quid a day for years. Some Eastern European roofers had come and were charging £150 a day. And I remember them telling me the story. It was a Labour MP, they tried to go and talk to Gordon Brown about it and say, what am I going to tell this guy? Like, not in any way a sort of, we don't want these people in our country, but it was an MP with a genuine concern from a constituent who felt so frustrated that the Labour leadership, as he saw it back then, wasn't acknowledging that concern. The economy was in a very different place. People looked at immigration in our political debate in a completely different way. But that's why that story was also so damaging. There was this sort of top-level embarrassment at having been very rude about a member of the public. But it spoke to something wider, which was that Labour had not wanted to acknowledge the concerns that people had about how quickly some of their communities had changed.
Also, I remember being in the newsroom with you, Laura, and the crackle. But also in the back of my mind, thinking, was there a different world where actually a judgment was made that Gordon Brown had an expectation of privacy in the back of his car, and actually maybe in a parallel universe that recording never emerged?
Oh, we had a whole big discussion. I mean, that was a discussion, and there was a decision by one of our other rival broadcasters to play it. And then once it's out there in the public domain, then, anyway, we probably shouldn't divulge some of that. But there was a question.
But the other thing I remember about that day was then when he was doing the Jeremy Vine show, Gordon Brown, at lunchtime, and we managed to get a camera in there, and you had Gordon Brown sat with his head in his hands.
Laura's got her head in her hands.
I'm doing it.
Now.
I'm doing the action. Yeah. I remember it.
And his team said, no, that's just how he sits when he's concentrating. And actually, you can sort of imagine somebody sat there, like, with your head in your hands.
What are the other up to polling day events? And when I ask this question, I should say to you listening that we have a team of producers, many of them now clutching their hip flasks.
Their heads in their hands.
Their heads in their hands, sorry.
Because they're concentrating.
Not their hip flasks, their heads in their hands. And I have been provided with a cheat sheet. And I'm not sure I really remember this moment, but I'm going to read it out as if I've researched it myself. Cameron's West Ham moment just under 2 weeks before.
Oh dear,
yes.
When he got his football team wrong.
What, did he?
Yeah.
I can't really remember that.
So he's like a supporter of Aston Villa, but then he was asked and his mind went blank and he said West Ham, or it might have been the other way around.
No,
I'm not sure.
West Ham,
it was a sort of devastating political moment, but it was a big gaffe. But it was a comparison. It wasn't a very eventful campaign.
Except I was actually it was on a Saturday morning, and I was the political correspondent on duty that day. Well, I remember it because I know nothing about football, and I had to talk about football for about 4 hours. And I was like, no, I was the only person that sounded less credible than David Cameron that day.
I hope you remember that it's a game with two halves, and it's not all over till it's all over. And then it's not all over. That's the key thing.
Can you explain the offside rule?
Well, there's not time on this edition.
That's a mercy. Boris Johnson also went to go and hide in a fridge, and it boiled out of the fact that Piers Morgan, such a wallflower, was so irate that Boris Johnson hadn't done an interview with him and Susanna on Good Morning Britain, on our colleagues over on ITV, that they sort of harassed him, and they got their reporter on the ground, more or less, to try to chase him into doing an interview. And he went and hid in a fridge. They were doing a morning visit, sort of delivering the milk at a dairy. So there was a reason why they were there, and there was a big fridge that a man could actually get into. So it's not like he was trying to kind of climb into a small fridge with the jar of Branston, but it was a more ridiculous.
You don't have
thing.
to keep your pickle in the fridge. Neither do you have to keep your eggs in the fridge. Can I just add? We've just followed Kitchen Cabinet when this is aired. If it's aired, if this edition is aired, then we will have followed Kitchen Cabinet. And Jay Rayner will tell you your eggs can nestle happily on your countertop.
Even if it's really, really hot.
Yeah, I'm moving on now.
Hang on, no, that's interesting.
How will people going into the booth be prepared, number one? And I think there's an underreported issue of the postal vote.
Yes, particularly if you are listening in Scotland. So there are irate, quite understandably, people who went on holiday, because it is now the school holidays in Scotland, and didn't get their postal vote in time. And there is now the beginnings of a giant mess with postal voting in Scotland, and there's some sort of emergency setups that have been put into place. But there are, and newscasters, tell us if you are a Scottish holidaymaker and you are on holiday and you haven't had your postal vote and you're going to be denied your franchise because the mail was a bit rubbish, then tell us. Anecdotally, and also the BBC in Scotland reported on this story yesterday, it's a significant problem.
Well, we've also opened a postal voting clinic on Broadcasting House for Sunday morning, because I've also heard of a household who have received 2 postal votes. Because of the boundary changes. So there's a lot of sort of innocent reasons why you haven't received a postal vote, why some people are reporting to us they've received 2. Adam, do you think that this is a trend, more and more people have been using postal votes since your career as a political expert started? Or?
Oh, yeah, political expert. That's not started yet. No, Chris was quoting the statistic the other day they were on Newscast, wasn't he? Which is that it's now up to something like 20%, having been in single digits in the 90s in terms of the number of people who get postal votes.
And the parties love it.
Why?
Because it means they can essentially get votes in the bag, right?
Right.
You know, vote early and often. I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with it, but the parties love it because it means that when they have areas that are sort of where they think they can count on people, it's literally getting your vote in early and often. And also they get sort of early indications of what is going on.
And also so much of the last week when it comes to the ground campaign is about just working out who is going to vote for you and making sure that they go out and vote for you. So when those canvassers come to your door, normally when like EastEnders is on, they're not necessarily there to convince you to vote for their party or their candidate. They're trying to gauge your level of enthusiasm for the political party and whether you are a person who maybe needs to be sent another leaflet or have a visit from the candidate in the next couple of days, whether you've already voted by a postal vote, or whether you're the sort of person that maybe needs a little nudge on polling day and maybe another little visit at maybe 7 p.m. on Thursday to check whether you voted. And I remember being quite surprised, I think it was in the 2010 election when I went out and did a piece about what those canvassers are actually doing, that it wasn't just the kind of, oh, please, can we tell you about our policy on like hospital parking? And actually it says sort of, not cynical, but as kind of methodical as that. And they just have a big list. And then, of course, it's also about finding out who's never going to vote for you. And so you shouldn't waste any time or resources on trying to sway that person at all.
And we will see on the last day, on polling day itself, a massive, massive get out the vote operation. I mean, literally people coming and knocking on doors saying, have you voted yet? Can we help you? Also get, you know, parts of the country where you have activists will sort of offer to drive people to the polls and those kinds of things, because getting the vote out, and this is a particular anxiety on the Labour side, getting the vote out really, really matters. There's a genuine fear in Labour, we were talking about it last week, that because of the coverage of the election, because of the scale of the polling gap, that many of their natural supporters might just think, oh, well, I don't have to bother because it's in the bag. And of course, sounds a trite thing to say, but every single vote matters. There will be seats where the majority comes down to a couple of hundred votes, maybe even less than that. And, you know, a win's a win, even by one vote. And no political party ever wants to feel that they lose seats because they didn't try hard enough on the day.
So we can say, just in terms, because we'll be back in a week, and we can say that turnout's going to be a player, and undecided voters who swing are going to be responsible for changing the makeup of Parliament. The polls have told us since we began to expect a change of government. So can I, with nerves fraught and we don't have to wait very long to know the answer, can I frame a question that's different to who's going to win, which is what happens on July the 5th? How quickly are the MPs coming back? What happens to what used to be a summer holiday in politics? What's going to actually happen? When will MPs of all stripes come and say, hello, I'm a new MP?
OK, so before we get to that, just briefly, because I think we haven't really said this, the Tories are going to keep on trying to basically scare people into not voting Labour. People will have seen that sort of surrender advert a couple of weeks ago. Source said to me, we're just going to try to terrify voters. You can see that's what they're trying to do. Labour is just kind of trying to do more of the same, create that atmosphere and expectation of change. In terms of the mechanics, once we get there, so the exit poll will drop on Thursday night at 10 o'clock. Bong! We probably know the result, the actual result, sort of early hours in the morning. It will probably become clear. It depends exactly when things come in. Then what's likely to happen is around about 10 o'clock in Downing Street, we are likely to see a candidate, whoever it might be, emerge to address the nation. We're likely then to see another candidate. If there's a change, we'll likely see then somebody else coming to Downing Street at about 11 o'clock then to address the nation. So look, if the polls are right, clearly this is pointing to a Labour majority of some variety with a huge range of options. But essentially we're likely to see this sort of transfer of power, if there is a transfer, or the confirmation of power, if there is a sort of miracle for the Tories, sort of mid-morning on Friday. Then they get on with appointing a cabinet, whether it's a brand new cabinet or a shuffled pack. If Rishi Sunak manages to hang on to power, that'll be on Friday afternoon. Saturday morning, likely to be the first cabinet meeting. So that is the sort of traditional pattern. But as you said, Paddy, expect surprises, but that's the traditional choreography of this time next week.
And MPs then arrive at Westminster on Tuesday, and you have to start, the first thing you do is elect a speaker, and then everyone gets sworn in, where they come in and line up and swear their oath. And then the weird thing is, because there's likely to be, irrespective of what the outcome is, there's going to be a big churn of new MPs, and then people have to make their maiden speech, and some people have to wait months and months and months to actually make their first speech in the Commons. It's not like everyone lines up and introduces themselves like a sort of speed dating event.
Will they go on holiday straight away?
I think if Labour wins, they are likely to extend a little bit so that they can say, look how hard we're working, look how quickly we're getting on with things. But I don't think they're going to do anything as radical as say we're going to work all summer. But there's an irony here that politicians at the end of a campaign are completely and utterly broken and exhausted. And that's just the moment where they're going to have to start working even harder, as we come to a close on Saturday's newscast on BBC Sounds and on Radio 4. It's been lovely to be with you. We will be back tomorrow on BBC Sounds. Paddy, you'll be on Broadcasting House at 9 o'clock. I'll be on BBC One at 9 o'clock. And then we'll be back together for Newscast. Adam, what are you doing for the rest of the day, quickly?
I'm going to get on the train, and Kirsty Wark was telling me it's going to be very busy because it's the first day of the school holidays, so I can do some research about who didn't get a postal vote on the train.
Excellent. Bring it back to us next time we all join together.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.